Hi folks, my name is Phil and welcome to Plane Tales, the series which looks at, well, planes. This episode will take a look at the ASDA 747. Now, I'll be honest, this episode is a lot longer than I had planned for, as it's more detailed than I thought it would be, so if you just want to skip ahead to the actual ASDA 747 part of the story, then I'll put a timestamp in the description below. Otherwise, sit down, have a cup of tea while we get on with it. For our viewers outside the United Kingdom, ASDA is one of the largest supermarket chains in the country and in fact spent well over a decade as the second largest by market share. Now, I am not going into the history of ASDA as that is far outside the remit of an aviation channel. However, I do need to give just a little bit of background story, but I'll try and be quick. Headquartered in Leeds, ASDA's history goes right back to the 1920s. Its initials are those of the Asquith family and associated dairies who merged their businesses in 1965 to create the company. It grew rapidly during the 1970s and 80s, mainly by acquiring other retail chains and businesses. However, by the early 1990s, it was well over £1 billion in debt and on the verge of bankruptcy. The company underwent a change in management, leading to it shedding its loss-making stores and selling off various non-supermarket businesses and crucially returning to low prices and a cheap and cheerful business model. By 1995 it had completed one of the biggest turnarounds in business history, having returned to profitability. In 1998, taking inspiration from the US Wal-Mart, ASDA begun to adopt the hypermarket model, and soon after, on July 26, 1999, ASDA was acquired by Wal-Mart for £6.7 billion. The ASDA name remained, as did their well-established green and white colour scheme. Now, that's enough of ASDA, and let's get back to their 747. Boeing 747-200 line number 391 rolled off the production line at Boeing's Seattle Everett plant and made her first flight on August 9, 1979. Designated a Model 212B using Boeing's customer coding system, she was delivered to Singapore Airlines a week later on August 16th. The aircraft was assigned the registration of 9 Victor Sierra Quebec India and had a seemingly uneventful time operating for the Singaporean flag carrier. In April 1985, the aircraft was sold to Olympic Airways and assigned the registration of Sierra X-Ray Oscar Alpha Delta and given the name Olympic Flame. The aircraft joined a former Singapore Airlines sister ship, 9 Victor Sierra Quebec Hotel, line number 387, which had been sold to the Greek flag carrier a year before. In December 1985, it was joined by another ex-Singapore Airlines 747 with the former 9 Victor Sierra Quebec Juliet, line number 399, joining the fleet. The 3 former Singapore girls walked alongside the Hellenic carrier's other 747, one which had been bought brand new in 1973. The introduction of these 3 aircraft allowed Olympic to restart its routes to Australia and Canada, both of which had been dropped in the late 1970s due to rising fuel costs. The 4 jumbo jets served destinations ranging from New York, Boston, Toronto and Montreal to Melbourne and Sydney. They also regularly filled in on high-density routes to London, Paris, Rome and Amsterdam, among others. Olympic Flame, along with her 2 sister ships, Olympic Spirit and Olympic Peace, loyally served the airline throughout the 1980s and 90s. They even allowed Olympic to introduce a route to Japan via Bangkok in 1990. Sadly, that route was short-lived, however, with the airline forced to drop the route despite exceptional load factors of well over 95%. That load factor is even more impressive when you consider that their 747-200s were fitted out with 426 passenger seats. The decline of Olympic Airways is a story best saved for an episode of the Grounded series. However, by the late 1990s the carrier was struggling. The flag carrier had suffered years and years of abuse by Greek politicians who let their families travel for free or a negligible amount, even forcing the airline to allow the press to travel with a huge 97% discount on airfares. The airline was a matter of national pride and the Greek government couldn't let it collapse, so instead it finally devised a plan to wipe out the debt and bring Olympic into profitability. None of these plans were successful. Even handing the management to a subsidiary of British Airways didn't work. Olympic began a modernisation plan to bring in more fuel-efficient aircraft to replace their ageing fleet, with the focus being on their Airbus A300-B4s, Boeing 737-200s and of course the Boeing 747s. Olympic already operated a number of 737-400s and through the late 90s introduced 6 more of the type. The Airbus A300-B4 fleet was replaced indirectly. The airline was already operating newer A300-600 models, so these, along with the larger fleet of 737-400s combined with a scaling back of Olympic's network, saw the older buses retired. The 747s were more difficult to replace, however. They both had a greater range and the largest capacity in the Olympic fleet. The airline couldn't afford, never mind justify acquiring shiny new, or second-hand for that matter, Boeing 747-400s. Instead, Olympic looked at another four-engine jet, the Airbus A340. While Olympic of course couldn't afford the shiny new fly-by-wire widebody, it could however justify it. The airline reached an agreement with the Greek government in which the government would buy 4 Airbus A340-300s and then lease them to Olympic at a much lower rate than they could have got from the typical leasing companies. The arrival of the A340s in 1999 marked the beginning of the end for the Olympic 747 fleet. Within a year of their arrival, 3 of the 4 jumbos had been retired. Olympic Flame, however, held on. The aircraft was retained in order to operate the Athens, Montreal and Toronto route. This, however, wasn't going to last, and by the end of the year it too was withdrawn. The last of the Olympic giants was grounded. In June 2002, Olympic Flame flew for the final time, leaving Greece and heading to the United Kingdom, where it landed at the former Royal Air Force Base at Bruntingthorpe. This was not the greatest of omen for the aircraft, as only 2 747s had visited before and neither left by air afterwards. Unlike the former Air France 747, which was blown up during the investigation of Pan Am Flight 103, the former Olympic Flame's time at Bruntingthorpe would be pretty much uneventful. Shortly after its arrival, its engines were removed and sold on, with the aircraft left to languish on part of the former fighter jet dispersal. In August 2006, however, the aircraft was adorned with a new paint scheme, one which would strike fear in travellers across the United Kingdom. Had ASDA decided to launch a new low-fare airline, one that would... The answer to the relief of the travelling public was no, they did not. The former Olympic Flame had indeed been repainted into ASDA's colours and adorned with their smart price branding and wearing the registration of G ASDA. However, this was not because they were moving into aviation, but instead for a more grounded reason. Like many companies that have a large fleet of vehicles, ASDA held an annual Driver of the Year award. These typically see the company's best drivers compete in a knockout tournament to be crowned the best man or woman, and for 2006 ASDA wanted to do something a bit special. The 747 was simply the backdrop to the event. After all, it was still missing its engines, though that made it easier to park the lorries underneath the wings. The aircraft was also to be used in a series of advertisements for ASDA, however I've not found any, be it printed or on television, whilst researching this piece. I could speculate that the commercial shoots never took place, however I fully expect about 4 adverts and a dozen newsprints to suddenly surface just days after this video drops. With its moment in the limelight over, parts of the promotional branding were removed, but it otherwise stayed in the lime green and white livery. The livery had only been applied to the left side of the aircraft through the use of vinyls. Over the course of nearly a decade, the ASDA livery was removed and the Olympic livery saw daylight once again. Of course, with the aircraft left to the elements, this soon ended up covered in dirt and grime. Incidentally, the registration was a fake. Well, sort of. There had actually been a G ASDA, however, that registration belonged to a Beech Queen Air between 1975 and 1989. Due to a very old rule which in no way will cause issues in the near future, the UK Civil Aviation Authority does not allow the reassignment of registrations. This is still the case, even if the previous registration is long since expired. Speaking of expiring, the former Olympic Flame's time was almost up, and with parts of Bruntingthorpe Aerodrome being sold off, space was now at a premium, and the old flightless birds like this one were facing the chopping block. Well, there were other historically significant aircraft there that also got axed, but that's a story for another day. In December 2020, the scrapping of Boeing 747-200 line number 391 began and the Olympic Flame was extinguished. I actually own a piece of Sierra X-Ray Oscar Alpha Delta, a fuselage skin section which has both the Olympic Airways blue and the ASDA green. It was actually delivered to me while I was recording this very episode. How freaky is that? There is one happy side note, however. The former Olympic Eagle, Sierra X-Ray Oscar Alpha Bravo, not only still survives, but is now actively being preserved at the old Athens airport, alongside some other former Olympic Airways aircraft. On that slightly happier ending, I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions or criticisms, please do get in touch. If you don't have a YouTube account, don't worry, I have a contact form on my website and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter. I have plenty more episodes in the works, so if you haven't already, why not subscribe and catch them as they land, and as always, thanks for watching.